Hi, good morning, and welcome to this morning's Zoom talk at the FCC. Today's talk is titled The Future of the Newsroom with Gina Chua, the executive editor at Reuters. I'm Dan Strumpf. I'm a correspondent governor here at the FCC and a reporter at the Wall Street Journal Bureau here in Hong Kong. Today's talk will be moderated by my colleague, Natasha Khan, who's a correspondent member at the FCC and also a Wall Street Journal reporter. Before we get to this morning's talk, I just want to talk about a couple of upcoming events that we've got at the FCC, really just one upcoming event right now. Today, actually, we'll be holding a speed mentoring event for early career journalists that'll feature a number of mentors from newsrooms across the city, The Economist, Bloomberg, Reuters, CNN, also the Wall Street Journal, and that is open to early career journalists who can sign up on our website by sending an email to the email address listed there. With that, it's my pleasure again to introduce Gina Chua, executive editor at Reuters. Gina will be talking this morning about ways that we should rethink and restructure journalism and newsroom processes in the post-COVID-19 era. Gina is executive editor at Reuters, a position that she's held since April 2021. In this role, she oversees newsroom operations, including budgets, safety, security, and logistics, among other duties. She's deeply interested and engaged in looking at new forms of storytelling and bringing more diversity to the newsroom and to the stories that Reuters produces. A native of Singapore, Gina was previously editor-in-chief of the South China Morning Post here in Hong Kong. She spent 16 years as a foreign correspondent and editor at the Wall Street Journal in Manila, Hanoi, Hong Kong, and New York, including 8 years running the newspaper's Asia edition. Gina, who transitioned in late 2020, is also one of the most senior openly transgender journalists in the industry. So with that, I will turn it over to Natasha. And I would also encourage anybody who would like to ask a question, please send along questions. We welcome and encourage questions. And you can do that by sending an email to question@fcchk.org. That's question singular at fcchk.org, and those will come our way, and we'll get those questions asked. And with that, I will turn it over to Natasha to take it away.
Thank you so much, Dan, for that introduction. And Gina, thank you so much for being with us this morning and your evening. We're so delighted to have you at the FCC, where I understand you used to come quite a lot during your time in Hong Kong. Well, I wanted to sort of start with talking about, one of the things you've talked about a lot is the changing models in journalism and the need for the industry to adapt as we become more immersed in the digital age. I wonder if we could start, if you could share more thoughts on this and your vision of structured journalism.
Thanks, Natasha. Thanks for having me. Yes, in honor of the FCC and my long membership, I am starting with a glass of Australian Shiraz. So, but it is late my time, so I'm entitled. So I guess the idea of structured journalism, and just sort of more broadly, the idea that we should be thinking more about what we do and why we do it, and what we give our audiences, our communities, our customers. If you think about journalism, you think about what we do. What we do today is not that different from what we did 50 years ago, maybe even 60 or 70 years ago. Sure, we have multimedia, we have moving images, we have photos, we have interactive text. But a lot of the core ideas remain the same, which is that we're writing a story, that we are trying to get to a large audience. And technology has really kind of moved along, and it's enabled us to do much more. Not to say that all of those things are great. In fact, some of those things are not great, but that we as an industry need more imagination to sort of take advantage of what we can do to better serve our readers. So I'll give you a couple of examples. There was a really interesting experiment by Google, maybe 15 years ago, called Google Living Stories, and this was taken by the late lamented Circa, which really sort of took the idea that when you read a story, you likely already know some background, especially if it's a running story. It's an earthquake, it's a hurricane, it's a court trial, and you don't need to read that background again. And so if you for readers who come new to the story, they want the background. For readers who have been reading it for a few days, they don't need the background. Why can't we keep track of that? Why are we giving them all the same story? So they're reading and they're going skip, 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 skip. Take another example. Let's say you had the world's best magical search engine. You asked the question, what happened to Lehman Brothers in the financial crisis? Okay, so and it pulls up not 10,000 stories, but just one story, and you read it, and you go halfway down the story, and it says, next week the Fed will, and you think, when's next week? And you scroll all the way up to the top, and it says, oh, July 15th of 2008. And it's like 1 week from July 15th of 2008 is July 22. Why do you do that? Why don't we take all the date references we have in stories once they go in the archive and change them from relative dates to absolute dates so that people don't have to do the work, right? I mean, so there are all of these little fixes we can do. And then the most interesting thing I think we can do, so I'm a business journalist, you're a business journalist. We all know what market reports are, right? And the market reports are, it's 4 o'clock, the market closed down 2%, or market closed up 2%, let's say. But you know how easy it would be to say it's 4 o'clock, the market closed up 2%, but your portfolio closed down 1%. And we don't do that. We could do that. Brokerage firms do that, but we don't do that. But even more interestingly, why can't we do it? And we can do it. So you can press a button and say it's 3:45. The market is currently up 2% and your portfolio is currently down 1%. Why do we have to wait till 4? Why can't we create news on demand, which we can? And then finally, if you add a little, what's known as perturbation analysis in there, you can do, it's 3:45. The market's up 2%. Your portfolio is down 1%. But if you hadn't sold IBM last week, you idiot, you'd be up 3%. Do you know how trivially easy that, it's actually not trivially easy, but it's a good talking point. Do you know how trivially easy that would be to do? It can be done. We don't do it. Why don't we do it? If we don't do it, someone else will do it, and they will steal a march on us, and they won't have the same public service intent that we have. So we need to move faster.
That's super interesting. So basically, would it be fair to think about it in the terms of, let's say, the entertainment industry and, how, I guess, TV has changed with the on-demand models, but maybe think about those concepts for news in some ways?
Yeah, I think it's partly that. I think it's partly, there's so many different models, right? I mean, technology has essentially changed anything that is information-based, even the things you don't think are information-based. It's changed it, and we're essentially all information-based, right? So think of what Uber has done to the taxi industry, right? And it isn't just like, it made hailing taxis easier. It suddenly generated an economy out of, at one point at least, slack demand in people's cars. Now, of course, it turns out that Uber is basically setting up an entirely separate cab industry or taxi industry, but at least the fundamental idea was that you would pick up, I guess the gig economy is not actually it's not a good word at this point, but it certainly rethought who were the workers in the thing and who had capacity. Airbnb, which again has morphed into something completely different, but the notion that you had slack capacity in housing and you could do something about it is, it's just a way of rethinking what the possibilities of technology. So the entertainment industry, the music industry, all of these industries have gone through their huge upheavals. We have as well, obviously, but a lot of the upheaval has come at our business model, as we all know, to our cost. Our business models have been affected, but we haven't fully yet grasped the impact on our product and frankly, what the opportunities might be for us to try and seize those opportunities rather than have them happen to us.
How do you think we can get there? You mentioned that it could, I know it was sort of a matter of phrase to say it's easy, but, what are the steps we take? Is it, organization level? Is it technology possible right now? Is it us as journalists rethinking the way we, how do you think that change can come?
Oh God. it's difficult, right? I mean, we are I mean, it's a really bad example. We're the buggy whip makers, right? And all of a sudden people have invented cars and like, what are we supposed to do? We're not really buggy whip makers. We're not buggy chassis makers. Anyway, but the what does it need? There needs to be some level of technology, sure. And our current CMSs, content management systems, don't allow us to do as much as we want. But technology is a solvable problem. What we really need, beyond some capital, which is also in short supply by and large, is imagination and culture. And I think that those are some of the big deficits. Now, it's understandable, right? Because nobody wants to try and climb out on the wing and try and fix the plane while you're in motion. And you know what sort of works, and these are all big bets. And I certainly, none of the things I've suggested are guaranteed money makers or guaranteed audience hits or guaranteed public service winners, but certainly they're worth exploring. And so I think what will happen most likely is that there'll be any number of small startups that will be trying new things. And I think that the young journalists that we referred to a little earlier, I think those are the people that will help us move on and think about new things. But it is fundamentally around the idea of imagination. Can we try something new? Can we see if it works, and and build the technology around it? I'll give you a different example. In some cases, it's not even like you need a whole whiz bang new thing. So the Washington Post, which we all know is a fantastic newspaper, one of the best in the world, and they cover murders in DC, and there's about 100, 150 murders a year in DC, and they cover basically newsworthy murders, and those generally you might expect, interesting person, young life snuffed out, a lot of people killed in, say, a mass shooting. Those rise to the top. And then there's just a lot of murders that aren't covered. So husband and wife couple, Laura and Chris Amico, 1.5, because Chris had a full-time job, so it was 1.5 of them, started Homicide Watch DC, which regrettably is now moribund, but it was a great idea. They decided that they would cover every murder in DC. The news judgment was every murder matters. And so they went out and they didn't do necessarily huge in-depth stories, but what they did was they made sure they covered everything. And they didn't just cover everything, they covered it literally soup to nuts. The initial report, who was the investigating officer, who's the likely subject, who's the suspect, but then they also just made sure they tracked it through the entire court system. Was somebody charged? When was the arraignment? Who was the judge? What happened? And they followed it all the way through. And they did this. This comes back to structured journalism. They did this in a structured way as a database of information that allowed them to create multiple different ways of looking at it. If you're all interested in all the deaths on this street over the last X number of years, you could pull that up. If you were interested in all the suspects that fit this profile, you could pull that up. If you wanted to know all the women under whatever age who were killed, you could do that. And what they found was that there was a tremendously underserved community that really cared about their loved ones being taken away from them. And they came by and started to follow the site. I mean, not in large enough, frankly, commercial numbers to make the site financially viable, which is why, unfortunately, it's moribund. But as a concept, it was fantastic. And I think it's that kind of imagination that we as an industry really kind of need to seize onto.
That's definitely, I mean, obviously a very sad topic, but definitely a very fascinating model. And I did want to, I mean, I know that one of your longstanding passions is for data journalism, and you've run a lot of great projects that I've been following since I started in the industry. So again, today, that's why it's so exciting, especially to talk about these issues. But sometimes I feel like, so for me, I'm a traditionally print journalist, and I've worked on some data projects with very talented colleagues at the Journal and at Bloomberg previously. But sometimes I still feel like many colleagues may feel a bit scared of data, or feeling like, oh well, I'm a words person, or what would you say to that? How would you get your colleagues or people on this Zoom call this morning to think differently about data?
Look, there is not a journalist out there who I think can say with a straight face that I'm a people person. I don't do numbers. It doesn't work that way anymore. I mean, look, data is evidence, right? And look, not every story has to be a data story, but there is data that proves things as opposed to sort of the 3 anecdote rule or the 3 expert rule, which, frankly, doesn't prove anything. It proves you can find 3 people to say something, or it proves that you can get 3, somewhat related things together and call it a trend. I think if you want to prove anything bigger than that, you do need real data. It's honestly not that hard. There's a ton of people that teach data journalism these days. There's online courses, and you just have to kind of get over some of that fear of numbers. But I really think it's core to every story. I mean, first of all, again, business journalism, I think business is core to a lot of things. I think numbers are core to a lot of things. It's, one of the things I like to say is, if you're a journalist and you're doing, anything other than just straight up breaking news, and even when you're doing straight up breaking news, you need to understand the concepts of probability and statistical inference, if you like, right? If you say, one person slipped down this stairs and broke a leg, okay, that's an accident, not a story. 2 people do that, 3 days in a row. Okay, that's like a really bad set of coincidences, and maybe there's something wrong with the stairs. 3 people, okay, it's a trend, and we have to do a story about how dangerous these steps are. Or do you, right? And the question there is, do you understand, it's a really bad example, but do you understand what the probability is of someone slipping and falling? And if it happens to be actually, again, really bad example, but you have to understand what is statistically significant and what isn't. Otherwise, your notion of what is news and what isn't news is skewed. If a building has, a work site has X number of accidents a year, is that number high or is it low? What do you compare it with? And you can compare it obviously with kind of the average of all buildings, but that may not work if it's a very particular type of building, it's a very particular kind of incidents. If you're looking at, I don't know, whatever it is, police killings or murders. I mean, so it's trying to understand what a baseline looks like, trying to understand what is a blip on that baseline. Those are the kinds of things that journalists need to have a better handle of. They need to have a better handle on basically social science methodology if they want to start doing anything, outside of, this is what somebody said and this is what somebody, this is what happened here. If you want to imbue meaning to things, you have to start looking, I think, at the broader context of what's happening and how to prove that it matters.
Got it. And moving to I guess a related topic. I think obviously we've just come off of an extraordinary news cycle, or I don't know if we're off it actually, but talking about really it's highlighted, I guess, the pandemic and other events in the last 2 years have highlighted the importance of in-depth on-the-ground reporting, whether it be visiting doctors or COVID patients in hospitals, or the political changes in Afghanistan. On the other hand, we talked about business models, right? I think many news organizations are talking more about, oh, we need clicks, we need this story to have more traffic, you need to have a, I mean, how does that reconcile? I mean, as somebody who, do you have any thoughts about this for journalists who are thinking about these issues, who both want to do, you want your stories to be read and traffic, but then how does that fit into the,
I mean, it depends hugely, right, on what news organization you're at and what your business model is, right? The Journal, I mean, that's the Journal that pioneered subscriptions way back when people said nobody would pay for news, and the Journal did, lo and behold, and all of a sudden now tons of people are paying for news. And when you run a subscription business, you don't look at clicks per se, right? You look at engagement, you look at renewal rates, you look at people sort of being willing to be a part of a community, you look at commenting and so on. And so you've got different metrics. I mean, at the end of the day, for commercial media at least, the metric is how much money comes in the door, but there are multiple ways that you get there. There are organizations, obviously, that are built on sort of high flyby traffic advertising. And yes, those will prioritize clicks. I'm not saying that's better or that's worse, but it's different. And I think that it's critical for any news organization or any journalist choosing to work for a news organization to understand what their mission is, what their audience looks like, and what their business model looks like, right? Because there are organizations that are, well, like mine, right, which are sort of a combination of general and business news. We have a whole range of audiences and models, so we're complicated and probably not the best choice. But at one level, we're a news agency, and one of our jobs is to provide news to organizations like yours. So you don't necessarily have to be there on the ground, and your reporters can go in and do the stories you want to do that aren't just based around the news. But then, you know, the journal is also, well, it's not a general purpose. It is a broad-ranging newspaper that covers a lot of ground. You can go further, you know, niche than that, right? You have organizations that just, like the Markup, that just looks at technology from a very particular point of view. You've got the Marshall Project that just looks at the criminal justice system in the US. You've got ProPublica, which just looks at investigative reporting. You've got the Philippine Center for Investigative Journalism in Manila that just looks at investigation. So depending on what your model is, I think sort of it sets you off in the right direction. I'm not going to try to sort of mediate between, you know, somebody who's joined an organization, they put them on the breaking news desk and they tell them, you know, you need to write 18 stories a day and they've got to generate this much, when what they all really want to do is, you know, go off and write, you know, one feature a year. Okay, not so good, but, you know, perhaps. That's sort of an internal struggle. But by and large, I think what you're starting to find is that organizations gravitate towards, you know, a few business models, and those that I think it's more and more unusual to find an organization that says, you know, we need to have huge traffic and we want to build a big subscriber base and we want to run an event and so on. I mean, I think what will happen is that as organizations sort of filter down into what their core audience and what their core business model is, they get much clearer about what their mission is to satisfy those people and to serve them well. And then it becomes clearer, I think, to the staff what it is that they're expected to do.
Got it. And I mean, speaking of that, you know, you mentioned the Marshall Project and others. I mean, right now, there are so many different ways people can access, interact, or obtain information and disinformation, right? Whether it be on, you know, I mean, I guess a lot of this is on social media, but, you know, how do you think traditional, I guess, I know I use the word traditionals in air quotes because I mean, now they're, you know, how do you really decide what's traditional or not? But how do news organizations fit into that landscape of this sort of information overload, but also you have, you know, the specialized companies and also the big organizations? How does it all fit
it's a great question. And I don't know that anybody really knows the answer, right? I mean, we're not the gatekeepers anymore, right? There's a ton of information that we used to have that nobody needs. You know, I mean, we all had the weather forecast. Does anybody go to the newspaper for the weather now? I mean, I'd be really surprised because I don't. Sports scores. I don't know that people necessarily go to newspapers for sports scores. I think they go to newspapers for stories and interesting analyses about a game, but not about that, right? And so even market news and stock data, do they actually need to? I remember the Wall Street Journal used to have tons of all these pages in the C section that we will look at stock prices. Well, you don't do that now, right? You Google it, it shows up somewhere on Yahoo or something. So, you know, where do we fit? I think we really have to understand what it is that is value for our audiences, and then we have to sort of figure out what they actually want and need from us as opposed to something else, and where they can get that information. I think there's a ton of duplication among news organizations to try and cover the same story in many ways, much the same way. And so that's not necessarily the most useful, you know, expenditure of resources that people have. I think, you know, I think that there is, there's the danger, I think, for the broader organizations that they get their audiences will be picked off by people who do one thing very well and very deeply, and that's obviously an issue for, again, large legacy old media like yours and mine, that we have to sort of think about how we play in these worlds. And then, as you say, there's just a huge level of questions about trust and misinformation. And I think that is one of the biggest challenges that we face, along with the challenge of distribution. Distribution has obviously shifted from us to platforms, and while there are a lot of questions about platforms, I think to a large extent we've lost a lot of that power, and that's why I think the notion of subscriptions, I think the notion of going back to the beginning of this chat, creating information that's much more personalized gets you around some of that, because if you can only get the market report that tells you should have bought IBM, that gives you a connection with an audience that is very hard for a platform to take away. I think the idea of immersive interactive graphics, which I love, again, is something that isn't, I don't know what the right word is, isn't Googleable in the same way, and so it brings people in. And then finally, I think there was a really nice quote, I think it was CNN's Brian Stelzer, who sort of said, the people that you say don't have news or don't believe in news, it's like it's not that they don't believe in news, they don't believe in the news that you believe in, right? They do have other news sources. They have talk radio, they have sort of more fringe news organizations, and they don't necessarily listen to yours. And so people are listening to information. The question is, how do you build that trust? And he had a really nice line, which is not, again, a great example because none of us trust the weather forecast. But he says, if you disbelieve your news organization, you still believe them on the weather forecast. They tell you to bring an umbrella, you bring an umbrella. Why? Because that part of that information is personal and germane to you. And so, if the newspaper tells you the street, outside your home is paved, and you look out and it's full of holes, you can't trust it. On the other hand, if it tells you that, the guys are coming to pave today, and they do pave today, you start to build up that relationship. I think one of the issues we've had is that, at least in the US, the slow death, quick death of local news has sort of undercut this level of trust. Now all the news is at a distance, and it's about places and people you don't know. And there's very little information about me and about my community and what I want. And I think that's where we have to rebuild trust, is locally and within communities.
Thank you so much for that. That was such a thoughtful answer. I wanted to turn a little bit into, I guess, internal newsroom, issues. And you've been very vocal about the need for more diversity among senior leadership positions. And could you tell us more about this? You're one of the most senior journalists in the industry. How do you approach and influence coverage now that you're at the top?
Well, most of you are too busy to do any of those things. But no, look, I do think that newsrooms need to be more representative of the communities that they cover, and I think the news we write needs to be more representative of the communities that we serve. And we honestly don't do as good a job as we should or could on both those fronts. I think part of it is just who we are and who makes decisions, and even for the people in positions of influence and power who may not look like all the other people, I think have all been socialized a certain way. I mean, that's partly how they got to those positions, to agree on what a story is and what a story isn't. And I think we need to sort of start expanding our definitions of what matters, who matters to, and why those stories matter. And I think we need to think also about what we have as sort of implicit in our story. So I'll give you a couple of examples. So one is, and this is a tweet that we did correct, so I don't feel bad saying it, but we had a tweet the other day that China sent up a rocket carrying 3 astronauts, including one woman, to the space station. What's wrong with that? So I sent a note and said, hey, what if we wrote, China sent a rocket containing 3 astronauts, including 2 men, to a space station that they were going to create. So when did astronauts become by default men? Why are why are sports, why are men's sports sports and women's sports women's sports? When did sports become men's sports by default, right? So part of it is language and understanding what the impact is on language. That's a sort of a fairly basic thing. But I think the really much bigger question that we need to grapple with better as an industry is, what is news? News is, as you learn in journalism school, news is things that are out of the ordinary, right? Plane takes off, not news. Plane crashes, that's news. Sure, that makes sense. Dog bites man, not news. Man bites dog, that's a story. But when you've got to sort of ask yourself two questions on that. One question is, what is ordinary? You have a particular experience in life. I have a particular experience in life. My view of what's ordinary is different from yours. Your editor has a different view of what's ordinary. And so if we accept that the people who are in charge, who generally in at least in the past 30 or 40 years have had a sort of a more singular experience, if we accept that that is ordinary, then what happens to all the other people whose view of ordinary is different? This is why I think diversity and representation matters, because you can come in and you can say, well, that's not my experience. You think that's news, but in fact, it's not news because it happens every day in my community. But what you've just seen here is not. And so I think sort of it's not that the people who are there are wrong. It's not that the people who came before are wrong, and it's not that the people who will come after us are right. It's that no single view is correct. Everyone's experience, everyone's ordinary is different. You need to have a broader discussion about what's ordinary, and I think that that's really important. The other part of it, and this is I quote and liberally because I've quoted him a zillion times, is Gary Yong, who was a Guardian correspondent in the U.S. and now a professor in the U.K., wrote a great book about killings of children, gun shootings of children in the U.S. And I think that's something like a half dozen get killed every day. And his point in this really good essay, you can Google it, Gary Yong, Younge, Man Bites Dog, or Dog Bites Man, is about how sometimes dog bites man is the story. Sometimes things happen so often that by definition it's not news because it's so ordinary. And yet it's a horrific story if a half dozen kids are getting killed in America every day. Surely that's a story, and yet it isn't. And his book has got examples of kids who've been shot whose death didn't even merit a brief in the newspaper. So you have to ask yourself sometimes, what is a story? So I think expanding this, I think I've digressed incredibly from your question, but my point is simply that I think it's important for us as an industry to sort of question some of the assumptions we've had about what's newsworthy and what's not newsworthy, what our language is, how we write about things, and how that communicates to audiences. I think at the end of the day, when you write stories that resonate with your audiences, or their audiences see themselves in them, I think we all do a better job from a public service point of view, and frankly from an engagement and ultimately from a business point of view.
Do you have any advice for, I guess, especially sort of younger journalists who might not, I think sometimes, and I'm not saying this is my personal experience, but you might pitch a story to an editor and you really believe in it, and you really think, as you say, that this is something that you really feel is a story, but perhaps I will say I have been told, like, not by my current colleagues, like, oh, that doesn't happen anymore, I don't think that, and how do you have any advice? I mean, except for, of course, keep pushing your stories, but as you may know, obviously sometimes as younger members of the newsroom, it might be harder to get your voice heard. I mean, do you have any advice for people listening to this on how to keep fighting for your stories?
Yeah, I mean yes and no, right? I mean, I think we all recognize it's a long, hard slog in the industry, and let's start off with the first default assumption: the story idea may not be very good. You, in fact, may be wrong. So you should start with that, right? Which is like, hey, that's a possibility, and that's where you need a community, people who can, who will challenge you, right? Not just your friends who say no, they should have definitely run that, but a community of people that you can bounce things off. I think it's important to have rabbis or mentors, or however you want to call it, in an organization to help you understand the lay of the land, understand where the pressure points are, where something can move, where sometimes something can't move, and sort of help you make those, bluntly political decisions about what works and what doesn't work, and when you should push and when you shouldn't push. But I think more broadly, there's obviously advice for individuals, like how do you get better stories in the paper? How do you find the time to get stories? How do you fight for that time? How do you get them published once you do them? How do you find good editors? That's one sort of set of advice. And often that's built around the notion of, what can you personally do better for your own career? And then I think there's a broader question about how can you help the organization get better so that you prosper, but other people prosper as well. And I think that is really much more the bigger question about how can the organization improve. So I think any individual one of us, if you're smart and personable and know how to find the right connections, can probably work their way through, even the worst organization in the world. Although honestly, if it gets too bad, just go work somebody else. But I think for people like me, I'm sort of trying to think about how we make the system work better, so that when there is a good idea, it can be recognized, and that more people come in and there are more voices heard on those stories. I know it's tricky, right? It's tricky because we're an industry that moves at speed. We don't have a lot of time for reflection. We don't have a lot of time to go back and say, I made a mistake. That was a good story. Too bad it's too late to do it now. I think, frankly, organizations that can peel off a bit of time to go back and reflect on the decisions that they made, not necessarily to change them, but to learn from them. I think those organizations that could do better. And to the extent that, young journalists can't do that, but I think their managers, should have much more of an obligation to sit and question themselves, maybe sit in a closed room and just take apart the decisions they made the previous day or the previous week and try to learn from those. Look, it's difficult. I'm not sure that we do that a huge amount ourselves, but I do think that there's a community of trust, at least among at least at Reuters, where enough senior people can come around and say, look, story ran last week, too late to do anything about it, but was that really right? Was that the best decision? And I think those are the conversations that help organizations get better.
Got it. At the end of last year, you shared with your colleagues that you'd be living and presenting as what I know to be my true self 100% of the time. Could you tell us more about the journey that brought you to that moment?
I don't know. How long do you have? Look, I mean, no. Look, I mean, I guess all I would say is I've been on this journey for a while. I've had sort of levels of disquiet and levels of questions, and then slowly an understanding of who I am and where I want to be. And and it wasn't the pandemic that made me. It's interesting when I say transition. I mean, yes, of course, I transitioned in front of people, but the truth, of course, I was always there. You just didn't know it. Basically, what happened was I told you, and also look different, but that's a slightly different issue. The two things, I guess. One is that the intentional part was I wanted to do it before I turned 60. I turned 60 this year, so didn't want to pass that milestone without getting. I didn't want to pass that milestone and think, gee, I should have done it, so I did it. And then the other thing was, I sort of made that decision pre-pandemic, and then the pandemic came, and I thought, this is not going to be good. This is definitely going to get in the way of this. And it turned out not to. I'm not to minimize all of the pain, suffering, and death the pandemic has brought, but when you're on a screen every day and you literally see nobody else except people in your household, and say, this is as much as you can see of me, and I can be anything else the rest of the screen. It really kind of helps you just settle into your skin and sort of understand who you are and inhabit who you are. There was no like day one, I show up and hey, I'm a different person, and much more just kind of an easing in. And so to some extent, I probably had one of the best transition experiences I think anybody could have. I mean, touch wood, but it's been great.
Well, thank you so much for that. And do you have any thoughts for other journalists or people working in other professions who are thinking about these things and looking for ways to be more fully themselves in the workplace? I mean, do you have any advice or thoughts for them?
Well, it helps if you run the budget and you transition, because nobody can really say anything at that point, just in case I cut their budget. No, it helps if you get to a certain point. Yeah, look, I mean, I think mileage will vary for everybody. I think it's, certainly transition is one of those hugely consequential decisions that you make, because, I mean, not that you can't take it back, you can take it back, but it's obviously difficult, and that people see you. It's very different from, I think, talking about your sexual orientation, which is not necessarily something that affects you at work directly, whereas this is, coming in and sort of with an effect, a different presentation and a different identity, and expecting people to understand that. I would say is it can be really difficult. I think it can be really difficult for people at the start of their careers, and wondering if it will impact their future. And there is no single answer. I think the only thing you can really sort of say is, it says I've turned 60, right? Life's too short. Life's too short to be someone you aren't for too long a time. I mean, you don't want to jump headlong into things. You do want to think about it, but when you've thought long and hard, and then you should go for it, and you should be clear what you want to do. I don't have any good advice other than that you should try to work at places that will accept you, and if they won't, then maybe you're not at the right place.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that as well. My last question for me before we turn to some of the questions from the audience. And by the way, if you do have a question, the email is question@fcchk.org for people who are watching live. My question is about, you're one of few journalists that have extensive experience in Asia, and, are born in the region that has since rose to the very top of the global newsroom. Do you have thoughts about, those of us based in this region who have similar ambitions? How do we make ourselves more visible to global leadership? Because, I think sometimes it does feel that you're not in headquarters, you're sort of the people in the other places,
Yeah, I think, I mean, look, I'll just say again, I've been very fortunate my entire career. I don't think I really kind of worked that hard at it, and maybe I should have. It's difficult. I think look, obviously do great work, right? And people will notice great work, but I know it's not that simple. I think visibility does matter, and you do need to find ways to be visible. There's good ways to do that, and there's bad ways to do it. I mean, the bad ways are obviously the sort of the highly politicking kind of, sort of just getting there right at the cocktail party when the boss is in town kind of thing. Don't do that. That's never nice. But I do think it's understanding the culture of your organization well, understanding, in some, I mean, this is going to sound hugely political, right? But it's understanding who's influential, who makes decisions. It's understanding what the culture of the organization values, whether it's, going back, somebody who breaks a lot of news, or somebody who does in-depth stories, or, again, it might be both, but sort of understanding what that culture values. And, we could spend hours talking about what the Wall Street Journal values, because it's deeply, deeply ingrained in me. But that would be different from what the New York Times values, or what the Guardian values, and so on. And I think sort of understanding that, so that you know how to move within an organization. Now, again, not saying you should change yourself for an organization, but you should understand what it would take to get that visibility that you want in an organization. If it's not what you want, then don't do it. But if you want that end goal, then you need to understand how to code switch. You need to be able to speak the language of the organization you're in. Otherwise, you're always going to be that person pushing on the door. Now, every now and then, there is a brave pioneer that pushes down a door, and that's great. And I think we should have more of those people. But of course, a lot of those pioneers also just wind up getting beaten down. So I think you just have to kind of decide where you want to be. If you want to be the person that knocks down the door, that's great. And you have to have the strength of your conviction and a lot of energy and allies. If you want to understand how the organization works, then sort of map it out and be intentional about how you should get there, get the skills that you want, get the portfolio that you want, understand who makes those decisions. And again, through all of that, and I know this is all contradictory and complicated, but through all of that, try to be true to yourself as well.
Got it. That's very valuable. Thank you for that. I have a few questions from the audience. One of them is from our former president, Eric Wishart. He asks, the pandemic has grounded journalists for international news organizations such as Reuters and his own, he works at AFP, as you may know, and who are used to traveling the world to cover stories. What will Reuters' policy be towards travel as the pandemic eases in the context of the agency's policy on corporate social responsibility and protecting the environment?
Ooh, good question. Look, I mean, I think we, like AFP and other global organizations, actually have a lot of people on the ground everywhere already, right? So to some extent, we don't need to travel as much as someone else does because, you know, you want someone in Ethiopia, we've got someone in Ethiopia. You want someone in Kabul, we have someone in Kabul, even though we, like you guys, got a lot of people out of Kabul as well, right? And we have people around. The lack of travel has been, you know, interesting in the sense that we've discovered we can do a lot more stuff remotely, and still have a pretty good level of coverage. But of course, it's undermined some sort of core underground reporting, certainly in the world of visuals, which we're big on, and AFP is big on as well. And sort of getting photographers and videographers to the ground has been really difficult. I think it's less about the question, at least to my mind, about sort of carbon impact on that, and it's much more about keeping our journalists safe. And how can you travel around the world, when there's pandemics everywhere, and still keep people safe? And that's been a huge part of certainly my job over the last 18 months, 2 years, however long it's been now, I've lost track. In terms of sort of making sure that we've got the right protocols in place, we understand the science of contagion and epidemics, and how we can actually go out and have people move around and still stay relatively safe. You can't get risk down to zero. I mean, the best way to get risk down to zero is everybody just stays home. But we all need as organizations for our mission to get out, and how do we do that safely? So that's the thing that I'm most concerned about as travel picks up, and there's still a lot of hotspots in the world that we need to worry about.
Got it. And I have another question from Bex Wright at CNN. She asks, do you think the subscription model of journalism will entrench and increase the polarization we have seen in society in recent years? She adds, for example, it's hard to imagine Trump fans subscribing to the New York Times, for example, whereas the right-wing publications are all well-funded and free to read. So what impact will this shift have longer term, and how can news organizations mitigate this, or should they?
Really good question, and I think something that we're all going to have to grapple with, right? I mean, look, I love the New York Times. We have it in the house. I love the Wall Street Journal. We also have it in the house. But we all have to understand that news organizations speak to audiences, right? I mean, you don't exist without an audience. There isn't an organization that really says we speak to everybody. I mean, okay, so we do, AFP does to some extent, but we're agencies as much as anything else, and we're trying to serve a large pool of people. I think the question is right to say, how do you think, certain people are never going to read The Guardian, and certain other people are probably never going to watch Fox News. How do you bridge that gap? I think it may be impossible at some level to really bridge it, except for that very small Venn diagram in the middle. I think a lot of this, gets solved in the long run, I think, by new news organizations that come out. And I truly believe that that trust is something that needs to be rebuilt again at a very local level, and probably by new brands, in the sense that, Fox means something to people now. Tomorrow, Fox could change. Tomorrow, you could take the staff of the New York Times and move them all into Fox. Take all the staff of Fox and move them to the New York Times. I'm not sure that people would change their minds because they both brands have become very iconic, and this is not a bad thing. Brands exist because they have powerful holds on our minds. But if we want to sort of start to reach across the aisle to talk to people who perhaps don't like our brand anymore, then perhaps we need new brands. And I think that that's where the optimist in me says that there will be the creation of new organizations that don't have all of the old brand associations, which is why I think, the idea like the markup, the 19th, the Marshall Project, the Trace, PCIJ, a gazillion investigative journalism organizations sprung all around the world, in Nepal, in Indonesia, in News Tapa, in Korea. I think a ton of them have come up, and I think those will build new brands. They will get some audiences, they won't get some others, because again, everybody speaks to an audience. But I think that that's where ultimately trust gets built, I hope, at sort of a local and not necessarily geographically local, but a community level. And I think that when you have that trust, you can start presenting information that hopefully people believe in, beyond, I guess, the misinformation and the information that they would like to believe in.
I actually wanted to add that, and you mentioned trust a number of times, this morning, and I think, and I really loved what you shared actually about the tweet about the astronauts, right? That why are we saying that, including one woman and not one man? I mean, two men. I mean, and sorry, I know that that's not necessarily related just to trust, but to me it is, right? Because it's sort of speaking to a wider audience at sort of just rethinking. Like it's a small tweak that really actually has, I think, quite profound implications. So, what are you? I mean, on a personal level, how can we rebuild trust? I mean, again, I would think from what you're saying, obviously we're all doing this anyway, but having fact-based journalism. But how about, what are some little tweaks, let's say in the copy or in our tweets or whatever, that you think you've seen that you think,
I'll give you one other quick story. This was in a really interesting New York Times story, and it was a quote from somebody else. And I take no credit for this, right? But there's a quote that the person says, you can say, Blacks have trouble getting loans from banks, and what does that say? Well, it says that there's something wrong with Black people, and that you should help them. You should give them financial literacy training. Or you can say banks generally don't give loans to Black people, and then the question there is, what's wrong with banks? Why don't they give loans, right? And so it's little turns of language. I think that's one part of it. I think if you're female, or at least you're in tune to the notion of equality, and you see a tweet that says including one woman, you think, like, does this story really talk to me, right? And so I think the idea that if we write better and we think better, I think we engage better with communities. So I think it is a question of trust. I mean, so those are the little things I think you can do as you write stories to sort of understand, who they're for and why they exist. I think, all of us who have had, actually not recently, but all of us who've had stories written about things we know about can always go through and nitpick something. It's like, why did they quote that guy? That guy, he's just always, whatever, right? And we sort of understand because we're in the business. We sort of say, oh, those civilians, they don't understand. We did this because I was on deadline and I needed someone to. But the point is that if people look at our stories and they say there's a flaw here, and there's a flaw there, then they question the whole thing, right? And if they say, it's like that conclusion that you drew doesn't necessarily jive with my experience. So I think it really behooves us to sort of say that the better our news can be, the more it really speaks to the audiences that we're really trying to reach. I think the more trust we build, and that is a matter of language, it's a matter of sources, it's a matter of framing. I think all of those things come in together. I know it's a lot to think about when you've got 15 minutes to deadline, so you can't do it every day, but you should think about it for the bigger and broader things that you do have time to work on.
Definitely. Another question is from Suhas Bhatt, who was formerly a reporter at the Asian Venture Capital Journal from India. He says, thank you, Gina, for sharing. It was most insightful. And he says that he's been part of 7 newsrooms and been retrenched thrice. So he's often thinking about the future of newsrooms in Asia, where there's been a consistent lack of capital support and the target audience doesn't pay, or I guess the subject, the countries that doesn't really pay in the place that, it's based. Is there a way to maybe increase that capital support that's really tap the capital support that's really available in the US? Or is the solution to really only turn to local sources?
Your mileage will vary, which is the best answer. The short answer is, I think, economics is a pain, but it is economics. And so I don't think anybody really manages to conjure money out of anything. I think, venture capitalists, as you'll know, because worked for one, want a return on their investment. And, sometimes they're happy to take a flyer on something, but ultimately over the long term, they want their money back. And so I think, so the idea of trying to figure out what a business model is that might work, whether, or for that matter, finding philanthropy and people who might otherwise, fund public interest media. I think, or rich billionaires who don't mind losing money on this. I think those are all the tricks. But the trouble is, economic gravity exists, and so you can't keep running something that doesn't generate some kind of return, even if the return is goodwill and happiness. So I'm, regrettably, having spent, a good, 20, 25 years thinking about this, there are no magic bullets. I think the only thing that really does make a certain amount of sense is rethink, being clear about what your audience is, serving it really well, because that may be valuable. Rethinking your product, which goes all the way back to the beginning of this discussion, which is that you've got to build a product that is defensible, that is somewhat unique, that has that engages an audience that wants it. And if you can get up to those two things, then you just have to figure out whether the audience you have is valuable in some way or another. And if it is, then I think you've got the makings of the future. And if you don't, then it's a problem. And I think the thing that really worries me is that there are audiences out there that matter, but they don't have money, and perhaps they're not valuable to people. We still need, from a public service point of view, to find a way to serve them. And that's where I think that's the most difficult part of this puzzle to solve.
Got it. And on that, I have the last question, which is from Dan, and talking about the demand for international news and how that's evolving, let's say for global news organizations. Do you have thoughts on sort of whether or how that's changing?
I think international news used to be the purview of a couple of news organizations like ours, because no one else would be there, and that's how we'd get the news around the world. I think, there's so much more news now, right? I can tap into the South China Morning Post if I want to know about Hong Kong. I can tap into the Straits Times. I can tap into Mint. I can, and so I think for, in terms of, what international news is, I think it's understanding your audience, right? The New York Times has a different audience than the South China Morning Post does for an event happening in the Philippines. They're two complete, and so it could be the same event, and they could be two completely different, entirely factually based, objective, high quality journalism stories, but framed very differently, because your audiences are different. And I think that's really where it comes down to it. Sort of, it's not expecting there to be one kind of international news for a lot of people. Again, we do some of that, but that's partly because we're providing information to a lot of very different people. But I think it's understanding your audience and their interests. Why does someone in New York want to know something about what's happening in the Philippines? Why does someone in Hong Kong want to know what's happening in the Philippines? Are two very different questions. And I think that's where international news needs to evolve much more towards, so that you're really giving your audience kind of what they need and what they want. If they don't need it and they don't want it, then perhaps you don't need that story and you can move on and do something else.
Got it. Gina, thank you so much for being here with us this morning. We are so delighted that you took the time to join us, and really appreciated your very valuable insights and sharing. So on behalf of everybody at the FCC, thank you again.
Thank you for having me back to my old stomping ground, the FCC, if only virtually, but so nice to be here.